This is like the worst Spark the Electric Jester fan game ever. He's not even yellow. This Sega fella should go back to like Digipen and learn how to make a real fan game. Sonic Adventure 2. Wow. I should really have talked about this game a long time ago. I really should have. I'm just gonna throw up chapters so that you can skip this next bit because I like to give an intro that's my personal history with the game, and if I'm being honest, me and this game, we got a history. The earliest memory I have of Sonic Adventure 2 was sitting in 4th grade history class, promptly ignoring any amount of history that I'd already been taught, just thinking about which character I wanted to play as first in the new Sonic game, because I thought it was going to be like Sonic Adventure 1, where there's a bunch of different characters and storylines in a big open world area, and why it was definitely going to be my boy Knuckles. Man, was I wrong about that. I remember waking up one October Saturday morning and watching Kirby Right Back at Ya on Fox Kids and getting a phone call. Someone was coming to purchase the snowmobile I had put up for sale. As a 10-year-old, this was the first time I'd ever earned any money of my own. I remember promptly going straight to a Zellers and buying a GameCube power source, GameCube AV cables, a GameCube controller, a GameCube memory card, and this game, because for some reason Zellers at the time was selling GameCubes completely piecemeal, and I've never understood why. I remember promptly going to a family friend's house and sleeping over there, playing this game pretty much until we both crashed out. We got to King Boom Boo. It was great. We crashed while in the KO Garden, and no, I'm not pronouncing it Chow because it comes from the word chaos, which is not pronounced Chows. And because I spent the majority of my life being nonverbal, this is just how I always called it in my head because I saw the logical consistency of how it was written, or the lack of consistency because the English language is weird. You're just gonna have to put up with this. If this makes this unwatchable because of it, I'm sorry. I remember waking up the next day and my KO had evolved into a hero KO and the family friends evolved into a villain KO and we immediately had to be rivals because of it. It was a lot of fun. I remember becoming one of the earliest proto speedrunners for this game, playing this game to try and get the fastest scores. And this was back when speedruns were basically just Quake demos and Radix's run of Metroid Prime. I'm kinda OG with this game a little bit. I remember spending so much time with this game that my original GameCube save file, its time tracker for how many hours played, actually straight up broke. I remember spending so much time researching the KO Garden and all the different combinations and stuff so that I could answer questions and be a helpful person on the internet. I ended up becoming GameFAQs' top expert on this game because of it. And hey, I guess I still am. That's neat. I remember going through high school and getting my very first MP3 player, a tiny little silver iPod Shuffle that could hold maybe, I think like 20 songs or something like that. And I promptly remember the first song I put on it was this game's theme song, Live and Learn, because this song made Crush 40 unironically my favorite band ever. And I remember 11 years ago creating my very first piece of content for the internet, a test video on this very YouTube channel you can go watch now, that still gets some watches every now and then. A video of breaking the truck chase in the very first level. The long and short of it is, Sonic Adventure and I have a long history. This game is very deeply personal to me. It was the very first GameCube game I ever bought, and to this day it's still probably my favorite Sonic game. And in a lot of ways, I've frequently cited this as kind of being the last good Sonic game. There's one exception, Mania, of course, but every other Sonic game after this fell hard on its face in some way or another. Even Generations, which was mostly okay. I want to put an asterisk next to that and say I've never played Lost World or Frontiers, and I've only played a little bit of Colors, but yeah, aside from Mania, I think this was probably the last really good Sonic game. And why is that? Well, as I've said numerous times, I don't think Sonic fans are all that hard to please. They don't even necessarily need their games to be fast. Sonic Adventure 2 wasn't particularly. The original Sonic was a game about standing around waiting for stuff more than actually running around. No, Sonic is pretty simple. It's all about good, clean platforming. And the biggest issue is most Sonic games that have come out since always try and throw some weird gimmick into the works. And maybe that would work if Sega ever sat around enough to actually develop it and like refine them, but they don't. Closest we've got to that are the Wisps, which honestly I think are intrusive in every game they're in. This is probably my favorite Sonic the Hedgehog game. It was a game that someone sent to me over the summer, and like it's a fast game and I like it a lot, and I thought it would be fast. My Steam version has like 50 hours sunk into it, so maybe not so much. But I love this game all the same. Now, the story to Sonic Adventure 2 upon revisiting this is incredibly awkward, very unexplained, filled with plot holes, and kind of confusing in places. Sonic the Hedgehog is a criminal. He's been hunted down by some government. They don't really specify which government he's being hunted down by, and also where he is specifically. I mean, we can rule out Station Square because that place was destroyed by a flood, and near as I can tell, nothing ever happened about it. Although the game does reference Station Square's missile, so that's nice continuity. Either way, Sonic must run from the law because he's a horrible criminal who did bad things. Aw, and Chris Chan idolizes him. She'll be crushed knowing he's a total criminal. Well, either way, Tails has promptly lost all the character development he had in the previous game and stopped being his own character and just continued to be Sonic's shadow, not that he's the only one this time. And Knuckles is Knuckles-zing about. His story is just kind of completely removed from Sonic's and the rest of the crews for like the first half of the game too. He's just sort of having his own adventure. He's Dad Knuckles. At one point he pops up through someone's toilet, and that's kind of interesting. And for some reason, the kid with a, 800 IQ or whatever, decides to think it's wise to let the tribal warrior who's never touched technology in his life control a space shuttle. In a world where they never needed a space shuttle to begin with because there's a teleporter that would take them directly to their destination in the first place. This game has issues. But the story is basically that of the fugitive. They need to go save the world while clearing Sonic's name while kind of becoming fugitives themselves, more or less just by association and lack of information. However, it's only kind of half this story. Similar to Sonic Adventure 1, there's actually multiple ways to play this game. But whereas the previous game it was all about multiple characters, now it's multiple factions with multiple characters within them. Some characters get more story, some less. Some get substantially less levels, and those are the characters I usually like. But we have the dark story where Dr. Evo Eggman Robotronic finds some mysterious hidden thing at a highly guarded military facility. It's a black hedgehog. Welcome to the world, Shadow the Hedgehog. And Shadow actually has an arc where he's actually quite tortured by the fact that his best friend got gunned down when he was much, much younger, and he has to deal with his own tortured existence, trying to get revenge, and also twisted feelings of regret and despair, while trying to ultimately move past it and become a better person while dealing with a lot of grief, and then would promptly get that thrown out just so Sega could continue to shove you in games where you had no right to be, for merch, I guess. After this game, Shadow kind of just becomes a completely irrelevant character though. Shadow should have been a one-off character, and I'm gonna be bitter about this probably till the day I die. Either way, he learns that thanks to Shadow, he can grab all the Chaos Emeralds and do evil. He's never thought of that before. It's an amazing brand new concept. Also, there's Rouge the Bat. She's here and she works for the government, but not really, but yeah, she does, and the government will still actively attack her because that makes sense, but she needs to get close to try and steal Chaos Emeralds because reasons. Welcome to the dark story. There are a few things in the plot that don't make a ton of sense either. At one point, Sonic has to go fight a boss, and Robotnik's in the same room just sort of laughing, watching him fight. And then after that boss gets defeated, Robotnik has to fight the same boss that Sonic just did, and Sonic's just hanging out in the same room, not doing anything. Why is no one taking advantage of this situation? It doesn't make a lot of sense. At one point, for whatever reason, the villains have to, like, follow Tails, and this is like an actual arc of the game. It takes like 4 levels, but they know that Tails is actively trying to hunt them down, so why not just let him come to them? There's also like this weird moment in time where characters just sort of jump around. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, the villains end up going to the final area and then coming back to an earlier area, then going to their own base, then going back to the final area, and then for one cutscene, for whatever reason, they go back to their base, only to, in that cutscene, go back to the final area. There was no reason for them to go back to their base at that one point. It almost strikes me that that was a cutscene that was probably planned to be earlier in the game or something, and some events got shuffled around or something. Also, this doesn't have anything to do with anything, but Robotnik's base is a giant pyramid. Did he build that himself? Did he actively take up the art of sandstone sculpting to build his own base? Or did he just appropriate a giant Egyptian pyramid, fill it with a bunch of robot stuff, and then carve his face onto everything, including building a giant spaceship shuttle launching platform from the center of the thing? I mean, either way, it's impressive, but come on, is this something he made? Did he learn a new skill? I need to know this. Also, why is the giant thing in space modeled after an ancient warrior tribe shrine? Like, they say it's to utilize the power of the Chaos Emeralds, but they must have seen this somewhere before and copied it. And why would it have a thing for the Master Emerald to just conveniently slot in to do all the stuff it needed to do, plot-wise? And why is there a version of Chaos in space? Multiple ones. Who did this? Did the previous scientists just decide that the weird ancient god of destruction that was trapped forever and had no access to the outside world, how did they create a new one, and several of them with multiple new abilities? I have so many questions about how this game actually works on a fundamental level. Also, again, it might just be like a weird cutscene that was just sort of weirdly recorded or something, but at one point, at pretty much the end of the game, Rouge tries to basically screw over the villains. And Shadow stops her and says, wait, you're saying you're that Rouge the Bat? You know, the government agent who just steals jewels? As opposed to any other Rouge the Bat that's also stealing all the jewels. Like, he in no way learns any of this. He just sort of knows she's a government agent, but apparently is mistaking her for someone else entirely. It's just such an awkward cutscene. I don't know. And of course, one of the weirder earlier issues is Sonic is a criminal because the government is mistaking Shadow for him, but they look nothing alike. Is there just some sort of species blindness at play, or is this game really speciesist or something? Because we can establish that the only hedgehogs in the game are Sonic, Shadow, and Amy. Does Amy look like the rest of them to the people? I mean, are there other bats that look like Rouge and have the same name? The point is that these characters seem to get like weirdly noticed and then weirdly passed off as other characters for no adequately explained reason, and characters only know each other out of plot convenience in the weirdest way framed. The story to this is full of plot holes. It's goofy, it's awkward, but it's also genuinely quite dark, and I mean, with maybe the exception of the original Sonic Adventure, it's one of the darkest I've ever seen this series have. It actually touches on some pretty meaningful concepts that I haven't seen this series really do otherwise. And I mean, yeah, sure, it's goofy, it's memeable, but it's memeable because it's memorable.
I found you, Faker.
Faker? I think you're the fake hedgehog around here. You're comparing yourself to me? Huh, you're not even good enough to be
I'll
my
make you eat those words.
It might not be the best written plot ever, but I think it kicked things up in terms of scope and scale and stakes, and I think it succeeded in a lot of ways. And you actually get a little bit of depth from the characters as well. You get to learn about Robotnik's extended family, his grandfather and his, I think, cousin? Although, wait, hold on. Robotnik's grandfather created Shadow. So does that mean Shadow is Robotnik's uncle? I don't want to think about that. Now, the gameplay to Sonic Adventure 2 is sort of in the same vein as Sonic Adventure, but it's kind of a regression of sorts. In Sonic Adventure 1, you had 6 different playable characters that had at least different variations of the same playstyle, and some of them were wildly different. In Sonic Adventure 2, you have 2 teams with 3 people that have a corresponding gameplay style to one another. So effectively, you've gone from 6 gameplay styles to 3, which means that I regret to inform you that the first casualty in all this was extreme fishing, as brought to you by the voice of Duke Nukem. Yeah, unfortunately Big the Cat got cut, although they continue to poke you about it because he's in every single level in some way or another. And most gutting of all, in limiting the game to only having 6 playable characters, Sega, in the most baffling decision they ever made, cut the best character in the entire Sonic mythos, Fark, the robot electric jester. You have to basically go buy a completely different game in a completely different series to experience his story, and I did, and it was awesome. This game has 3 gameplay styles. Sonic and Shadow are sort of the standard Sonic gameplay style in 3D. You have to get from point A to point B in these stages basically as quickly as possible, although there's a new caveat in this that will affect all gameplay styles, and that is that there's a style and point system. Specifically in Shadow and Sonic's game, if you create a large number of chaining attacks against varying opponents, you can get a bigger score, which will get you a better rank at the end, and if you get high enough rank across all your levels, you get a bonus collectible, which is helpful for completion. But their gameplay is relatively simple. You run, you jump, you have a homing attack that is, well, sometimes it doesn't want to work. This game has an interesting relationship with context. We'll talk about that in a bit. But ultimately, their goal is to get to the end of each stage as quickly as possible. Next, you have Robotnik and Tails. And this one is weird to me. They play basically like a bigger, clumsier version of Gamma from Sonic Adventure 1 if you played that. If not, it's a third-person shooter that focuses heavily on creating combos of locking onto multiple opponents at once by firing multiple missile barrages. and I feel like it doesn't nearly work as well as it could. I'm a mech guy, please understand that. Like, Gundam is one of my favorite things. That's probably why, like, the last 5 videos I've made are on mechs in some way, shape, or form, but I really don't like it here. And it's been a while since I played Sonic Adventure 1. I'm gonna have to find a copy and do that again, but I just remember Gamma controlling a lot smoother than this. If you try and backtrack with these characters or walk in a circle, they take like this huge reversing sort of turning radius that actually makes locking onto things a little bit tricky. It's slower and more clumsy than you necessarily think. Also, once again, I have to question Tails' intelligence here as the 800 IQ Fox Boy, because he's flying a plane that turns into a super plane, that turns into a mech, that turns into a super carmobile. And like, how is this guy this smart? He's certainly not a structural engineer, because if you've ever built a transforming Gundam, you'd know the more articulated points for transformation, the less structural integrity you have. This thing should be falling apart with every step it takes. I mean, Robotnik's mech makes at least a lot more sense. He basically just has a bolt-on add-on to his pod that's a pair of legs and a gun. And I assume that's some sort of universal standard of connecting equipment or something, but it just makes a lot more structural sense. And because Robotnik is relying on universal connection bolt-ons for his mech and not a flimsy transformation sequence, he has infinitely more structural integrity than Tails' Tornado. I guess this just proves that Robotnik is the actual genius here. He certainly has the body of one. Also, seriously, that was Sonic's plane. Did you ask his permission to turn it into a super carmobile, Tails? I don't think you did. I think you are actually a criminal because you stole that plane from Sonic, Tails. Also, the choice to make Tails and Robotnik Mecha Arcade mode doesn't make a ton of sense. They had to do this, I assume, because they wanted to have equivalence on both sides, primarily for multiplayer combat, which I'm not sure how much use that got in the entire world, but I'm not sure it was worth that design change. Tails already had a gameplay style in Sonic Adventure 1. It was racing Sonic as quickly as possible and cheating as much as possible because the Sonic AI was really incredibly cheap himself. But making Tails a mech arcade thing, okay, I guess I can understand that shift, but I don't really understand the choice with Robotnik. From the first level of the dark side, you end up playing as him assaulting a military base, but that doesn't really strike me as his style. There's a reason why he's always a final boss that's hiding behind robots that involve tiny little animals he's captured and imprisoned. It's because he's not a frontline fighter. He doesn't do this sort of thing. It doesn't strike me as something that makes sense for his character. I think it would make more sense to make his stages themed around maybe collecting parts and building robots to fight for you, make his stages maybe a little bit more puzzly and collecty, but unfortunately we have to have him fight Tails in the multiplayer mode, so we have to find a way to make them play the same. So let's just give them a knockoff version of Gamma's gameplay style from the previous game. I don't know, this is a choice that I don't understand to this day, and I'm not really sure it makes a lot of sense for the characters themselves. But either way, you're running around shooting things in a mech, trying to get to the end. It's basically a slower version of the Sonic and Shadow gameplay mode with more of a focus on arcadey combos than speed or style. And finally, you have Rouge the Bat and Knuckles the Enchilada. Their gameplay style is kind of like N. Knuckles' from the previous game, except made worse. Okay, so if you've not played Sonic Adventure 1, the whole thing about Knuckles was that he had to find various pieces of the Master Emerald, his big shiny jewel that shattered into a million pieces. It's very much the same here, except for one level where he has to find keys, and Rouge has a level where she has to find keys and some Chaos Emeralds, but they're all functionally the same. Although you are basically playing a game of hot and cold in triplicate using little radars. How either of them can find keys is beyond me, but just go with it. They have the ability to do this, I guess. However, there's a regression in abilities here that actually makes it worse in terms of quality of life. In the previous game, you had 3 emerald shards you had to find in any one stage, and you had 3 radars to find them. While that is still very much the case, in this game, you can only go after them sequentially, or at least the game will only tell you about them sequentially. So in the previous game, if you got close to any emerald shard, you'd find one of your radars that corresponds to that shard ping off about it. In this one, your first radar corresponds to 1 emerald, your second one corresponds to the next, and you can't take them out of sequence. So you could be standing right next to an emerald shard, but unless it's the next one you need, you won't know about it unless you see it visually. I don't know why this was a decision that was made, but it's functionally worse. The only thing about this I can think that might work better is you're less likely to overload the player with multiple things to look for at once, maybe, but in general it just feels like a regression of mechanics for me. Every single character across their stages can find various power-ups hidden about that can either help them in combat, which really just means fighting the other character in like the weird versus mode mandatory fights they throw you in, where the enemy gets a much better move you're not allowed to have, or ways to get through the environment, except for one power-up that every character shares that's pretty much on the final stage for every character except for Knuckles, which just allows you to make one interaction with one obscure part of every level that you absolutely need with one variation of every single level. I guess I should talk about that. So, every single level in the game actually has 5 variations to it, except they're not that varied. They're pretty much identical across all of the stages, except for the 2 weird kart stages they threw in, which I can only assume is there because they added kart racing to the multiplayer. Look, okay, this isn't the first time Sonic's ever had kart racing. It's been around since the game year, but they could have axed all of that and just had more main stages, and it would have probably been better, because the multiplayer aspect of this only has 3 levels, and they all look functionally the same. The layouts are different, but they're the same stages. I'm tangenting now, but I am frustrated about the inclusion of the kart racing. Like, it's cool, it's an extra little thing. It's not well thought out, it's not particularly fun, and for some reason all of these stages have weird 90-degree turns, which Fujiwara Takumi himself couldn't drift around properly. This is bad racing stage design in a game that isn't built for it. Plain and simple. Where was I? Right, stage variation based on the 5 variations. So you have your standard stage, which is the story stage. This is more or less the most varied these levels will ever be because it's dependent on what you had to do during the story, which sometimes did throw some variation your way. The second level variant is just collect 100 rings as quickly as possible. The third variant makes me angry to no end. I spent hours playing this variant as a kid, not understanding how it is. So there's a KO missing in the world somewhere. That's all the information you've got to go on. And while you're supposed to go find it, what you're actually looking for is a little shrine that's hidden off in some weird corner that the camera just doesn't like to show you. But you better know that you're looking for it, and you better hope that you have a power-up that corresponds to it, because if you don't, you can't do anything about it, and you'll just loop this stage forever. I may have wasted a few hours as a child on this, and it still scars me a bit. The thing about this is you need a specific power-up that you can't get until basically the last stage for each character. And the thing is, the game is more than happy to let you select this stage variant without knowing that you need this power-up or even necessarily what you're doing. This is just obtuse and badly thought out. The fourth variation of the stages is just get through the stage as quickly as possible under a time limit, which some first stage variants already do, so it's not that big a deal. And the final stage is hard mode, which is not that hard at all. It's really more, we just made a couple more obnoxious obstacles, and that's sort of your lot. Now, you might be asking yourself, why exactly do I want to go through the same stage 5 times? Well, in addition to giving this game a lot more replayability, and trust me, making you feel like this game is substantially bigger than it is every step of the way and that it only gets bigger is a huge strength of this game. The core premise for going through each stage's multiple variations is to unlock more emblems, the core collectible that lets you unlock very minor things by the end of the game. And if you manage to get the highest rank in every variation of every stage, you'll get another additional emblem for each character. This is where that style and point system comes back into play, because you don't get a high enough rank unless you have a high enough score. Score is primarily determined pretty much almost exclusively by speed, at least in regards to Sonic, Shadow, Rouge, and Knuckles. Tails and Robotnik have a slight variation of this that relies slightly heavier on having more consistent large combos, but going fast is usually the best way to earn points in this game. And this is where I'm going to bring up this game's tenuous relationship with context.
So, what does that mean?
It means context sensitive. It's sensitive to context.
Because this game has some issues that really need to be hammered out. So this game has a lot of weird contextual commands. Some of them are completely pointless, like wandering around a stage you can just pick up random objects that you can't do anything with. Others are very, very important, like the use of Mystic Melody, a power-up that, like I said, you need for the Find the Lost KO mission, and that's the sole reason it even exists in the game. But there's frequently issues with how this game understands context, because sometimes the game will just decide, okay, this is clearly what you need to do, so I'll make it the default option for your action system. The problem is it's incredibly dumb. Sonic and Shadow get the ability called Light Dash, and Light Dash basically lets you follow a trail of rings very, very quickly, usually circumventing terrain itself. This can be outright necessary in some situations because you will otherwise die. Yeah, sometimes the game doesn't really get the context of you wanting to use the Light Dash, and if you're falling and you need that, you might fall to your death. Or it might start a Light Dash, collect the first ring in a line, and then ping you off into space because it didn't understand that they wanted you to go to the next ring in the sequence. Or In Sonic's specific case, because he has a power-up called the Bounce Bracelet that lets you bounce on the ground really high to get a bigger jump, maybe you don't want to use the Light Dash against this line of rings that are going to save you from falling into this pit, and will just dump you in the pit faster because you decide to drop dash into it. This becomes possibly even worse with Knuckles and Rouge, however, because with Sonic and Shadow, the lack of context can kill them. With Knuckles and Rouge, it can ruin how well you're actually playing the game. Success in their stage is based on finding the emerald shards quickly enough, and without using hints, but there are hints if you need them. These hints are in the form of these random monitors hanging around, and you can walk up, press B, and they'll give you a hint. You can get 3 hints for every emerald shard that ascend in more and more usefulness to deduce where you need to look. The thing is, to get these hints, you have to press the action button, I think it's B button on a standard controller. I'm kind of using a weird controller because it's Steam. The thing is that the button you need to access the monitors to get your hints is the same button that they will dig in order to find a crystal shard, as well as punch to both destroy enemies that might have those crystal shards, or obstacles that might be hiding them as well. And if a monitor's around that, that'll actually supersede anything else. So you might be going exactly where you need to go, try and dig only to get a hint. Now, where's the problem in this? It might cost a couple of seconds, but what's the big deal? Well, the thing is, for every hint you take a massive deduction in points. That means your score will probably not be able to do well enough to get the A rank you need. And that's frustrating enough because in a lot of their stage variations, these items are randomly hidden. So you have to kind of know sort of a vague idea of where they are and then go after them. And if everything lines up properly and you know where they are and you go after them, only to have those points taken away because context missed the mark because you didn't need a hint, you just wanted to get the thing, that is frustrating beyond all belief. There's a particular level Sonic has called Pyramid Cave, and it's likewise is incredibly frustrating for context because sometimes you have to pick up a key, which is, near as I can tell in the main gameplay, the only time you ever actually pick anything up and it's useful. But sometimes it just decides that you don't want to do that and you want to do something else entirely. Like, I find that the Light Dash, the hint system, the context in this needs to be a lot better than it is, and it really ends up punishing you for actively trying to play the game because the game didn't understand specifically what you wanted, but it made an educated guess that was wildly off base. And that's frustrating. But let's alleviate the frustration by talking about probably one of the coolest things in this, the KO Garden. And once again, no, I'm not going to pronounce it Chow. This is a completely side thing that I have spent probably hundreds, if not thousands of hours in my lifetime. It is a evolution of a system that was originally created in Nights into Dreams and probably much more easily identifiable to most people, kind of an evolution of Tamagotchi. The idea is that you find a key in the stage by finding hidden crates, and then your character can just go here whenever in the level select. Once you get here, you'll find that there's a weird little garden thing with 2 eggs in it, and oh hey, there's 2 little imps that just popped up. Let me out. Oh god, I didn't do anything. These horrible little monsters trapped me in here. These are the KO, although the game pronounces it differently and I refuse to. These little imps are effectively reflections of your characters, sort of. You have to take good care of them, look after them, or they'll die. But as you take care of them, they'll reflect more and more of your character's hard work putting towards them to show a greater evolution of who they are individually. As you destroy robots and as well as crates in stages, you might find animals or chaos drives, which you'll note are not pronounced chouse drives. Just saying. I'm not letting go of that. These are basically food for your KO. You feed them animals and they'll suddenly adopt animal parts. These are kind of a little bit annoying because they're somewhat random, but it's kind of cool to see that they develop things based on how you feed them. You feed them chaos drives and they'll build up stats. And these are somewhat more preferable to animals because if you don't like animal parts, they're not on your KO, but they also don't reduce your stats. Depending on which side of the factions that your KO likes, they'll either develop into good or evil or neutral, although weirdly enough, if you want your character to be more like Sonic, you don't want him to be a hero. I wonder if that says something about Sonic's morality. Why are you tripping? You don't even have legs to trip on. By feeding them specific chaos drives, you will influence their growth ability. If they're built more for swimming, they'll start swimming around the garden. If they're more inclined to run, they'll stop crawling, they'll start walking, and eventually start dashing around. If you've taught them how to fly, they will climb up cliffs and fling themselves off of it. It's really cool to see them ultimately evolve and become more than what they started as because of your own input. I love virtual pets, and honestly, this is probably why, because I spent so much time here in the KO Garden, spending so much time trying to see all the evolutions and all the different stuff. For this playthrough, I even tried to replicate my original KO, and
That Pripple is not exactly what the customer wants.
I got a power type instead of a neutral type, but still, you know, it was fun. And I made this little guy, which was a swimming type, and I always thought this was one of the coolest looking ones, and yet I don't think I ever actually made one, so that was kind of a cool thing to revisit that I missed out on. You can give your KO legendary animals such as phoenixes and dragons, and sometimes they'll pick up new abilities like breathing fire, or if you give them a ghost, they won't have legs. Seriously, why are you still tripping? If you take away their legs, they trip on their feet somehow more. I don't know why. If you give them a skelly dog, they'll start putting on hats. I'm not sure why that needs to be a skelly dog thing. If you give them a kappa, they have a little flame above their head. It's neat to explore and see what sort of results you get to make your own custom little virtual pet thing. I love this. Unfortunately, I feel like there could be so much more of this. Don't get me wrong, if you compare this to the KO Garden in Sonic Adventure 1, it is leaps and bounds better. But this feels like it's supposed to be a huge time commitment. Your KO actually ends up evolving twice over its lifetime. The first time after 3 hours of in-game observation, you have to be here and look at it to do it. The other is like after 15 hours. So they want you to spend a lot of time here and do stuff, but really, all you do is go here, give your KOs a thing, and then leave. You can enter them into races, which kind of will give them advantages depending on which sort of aspects you've invested into their abilities. And if you have the DLC, you can play karate, which I can't show, but that's more or less random based on how much power and stamina you have. But all of those things are more or less just for additional emblems, and emblems ultimately come down to just buying more random things for the KO Garden, specifically egg colors. And ironically, even if you have all the emblems, you can't have all the egg colors, because the game just decides from a random pool which ones you can potentially get. I know, because I spent 500 hours on my original Sonic Adventure file before realizing that, just waiting around looking for a purple egg. I never got that purple egg, I had to start a new file to get it. And once again, purple is not in the rotation for this save file, which sucks. You can breed them together, combining singular color KO with dual color KO to create all sorts of crazy, weird, and rare variants. There's jewel colored, there's shiny colored, there's mono colored, there's two-tone colored, light and dark, neutral. There's weird combinations that don't quite work the same on various versions. Like, I know on the GameCube version, if you made a jewel mate with a shiny two-tone, you'd get like a weird one that was entirely clear. That's apparently been modified to be different in this version. There's so many different things in here. Like I said, I've spent so many hours in my original version of Sonic Adventure that the save data time tracker broke, and I'm sure most of it was just hanging out here looking after all these little imps, trying to see what they were all about, seeing them interact in weird ways, taking them to kindergarten so that they can learn to play the trumpet or maracas or sing or draw, taking them to the races so that we can unlock a little TV that they can ignore in the garden, or like a ball or something. There's lots of stuff here and I love it, but it feels very, very shallow at the same time with no real end game as to why you're even doing any of this, aside from getting more emblems so that you can get more stuff that you can put here. And if you have the DLC, you can unlock one extra level down the way, I guess, but it just feels a little underwhelming and pointless, but with a huge time sink that they expect you to take if you want to actually complete the game too. I don't know. I love this, but I feel like it could be a lot more in depth and it could have a substantially higher payoff in regards to why you're even doing this, aside from like 5 emblems. It just feels a little watered down for the time investment, you know? That said, I kind of love this more than anything. This is possibly my favorite thing in the game. It's just great. And I mean, heck, you got time trial boss battles to get more emblems if you want. You've got kart racing if you care that much about it. You have a versus mode that doesn't seem all that fun to me, but okay. I couldn't test it here. I played it once on the GameCube and it was not worth the time, honestly, from what I remember. But there's lots of stuff here, and every time you feel like you've seen everything or done everything, something new pops up and you unlock something else. And I love that. This game feels like it has an infinite wealth of content. And while that's not quite true, it certainly does give the impression that it has a lot more going on than it really does, and you can really latch onto it. If this game hits for you, you will be here playing it for a long time, and it feels good, barring, you know, the weird contextual stuff. Other small little nitpicks are the fact that there really aren't that many unique power-ups, nor are the ones that we do get all that interesting. Sonic gets a pair of gloves that he can wear that if he walks up, stops, press a button twice, and does a special thing, he can turn enemies into little balls that he can then throw at enemies. It's underwhelming to say the least. Knuckles gets a rebreather so he doesn't drown, which is useful because he's the only character that gets levels primarily underwater. He gets sunglasses at one point. Robotnik gets extra armor. Like, it's nice, but they're not that special. And a lot of the other power-ups are just sort of universal. Everyone gets a Mystic Melody. Everyone gets the ability to break steel crates, which makes me wonder why we used those to begin with, other than to just gate off other power-ups until much later in the game where you have to revisit previous levels. I don't know. I feel like they could do more with this. Likewise, bosses are a little underwhelming, just in the sense there's not a great deal of variation between them. The first boss, regardless of which side you play, is basically identical, and there's another one you fight during the dark side route that's basically identical, except it doesn't have legs. You have to fight your rival opponents, which are very, very dull fights. Although the second time you fight them, they have stronger power-ups that they can just pull out of nowhere from the versus mode that you don't have access to, which feels certainly very cheap. And even in the versus mode, you had to pick up enough rings to actually use it. They don't. So they're just pulling out super moves just to cheat, really. There's one boss that you fight both as a light and dark character, and to be fair, they fight completely differently, so that's actually really, really cool, but it's still the same functional enemy. Even the final boss gets reused, kind of, in the sense you fight them twice and they don't really look all that different one way or the other. In fact, off the top of my head, I think there's a total of one unique boss fight in this game that doesn't get reused in some way, and that's the big ghost Knuckles has to fight, primarily by running away from it. I don't know, I feel like there could be so much more with these bosses. I mean, these are different factions fighting at different periods and places in this world. Why are we fighting the same enemies over and over again? It just seems a little underwhelming, and there could be a lot more variation to the bosses. Heck, as the good guys who are running away from the government and presumably endless amounts of funding they have, aside from the first boss, you don't really ever fight them as a boss fight ever again. They're just kind of a minor annoyance at the best of times. Also, side note, but why are there advanced robots in the final area? Because to my knowledge, that's been abandoned for like 50 years. Did they have these advanced robots 50 years ago and just leave them up there? It's something that bugs me. I don't get it. They're even there while the power's off and the entire place is shut down, so clearly they had these advanced robots in the past or something, so they haven't really updated their equipment in 50 years. Military contracting, I tell ya. The overall presentation to Sonic Adventure 2, I think, looks really good, even now. I remember when I first got this game on my GameCube way back in the day, my next door neighbor, who had only had an N64 before this, asked me how it looked and how much the graphics had improved, and I think that was the first time I ever really heard the term graphics, and I didn't even really notice that it was so much better than the N64 until I took him over and we saw this and we compared it, and it was just so mind-blowing how cool this game looks. If we compare this to the original Sonic Adventure, the character designs feel a lot more fleshed out, a lot more well thought out and designed. In the original version of the original Sonic Adventure, the characters were a lot more squat and a lot more awkwardly designed. Here it feels like they really nailed that design and they know what they were doing with it. The enemies look great, although I wish there was a lot more variation to them. Why do the government people only have like 3 or 4 different robots and a couple variations of them if you're playing on the harder mode? I don't know. I feel like we could use a greater variation of enemies. The environments look great, although every environment gets used 2 or 3 times, but again, that's saving resources and stuff, and the game looks good enough. That said, this is more or less an HD re-release of it, and it's got the same issues that making an HD version has. Some cutscenes are like weirdly cropped, whereas others are full screened. There's weird missing textures in some places, and not just that one place where I was actively looking in a place no camera was supposed to be able to actually see. No, just right front and center in some places there's just weird missing bits of texture here and there if you look. But overall, it looks great. Audio-wise, well, first of all, this is totally a personal taste thing, but I think Sonic Adventure era was probably the best era for voice acting for Sonic. All the characters sound pretty solid. For the lines they had to read, I think they did a pretty solid job. And, you know, as much as people like to make fun of this game for its goofy lines and whatever, there's one moment that really stands out for me. It's the flashback Shadow has of watching his friend die before his eyes. You can hear the utter desperation in his voice. Maria! Like, it's such a small moment, but clearly the acting talent is here, and it was just beautifully executed. Although, I think one of Robotnik's lines is actually the Japanese line, and they didn't actually replace it in English. It's just paying the KOs, it's not a big deal, but someone pointed that out to me, and more, yeah, I think that's what happened, is they just didn't replace that line in English for some reason. The music is absolutely stellar. Basically every song in this game is a banger. Green Forest, White Jungle, Radical Highway, City Escape, Wild Canyon, Meteor Herd, Pumpkin Hill. All of these are great, and they all feel very different depending on the characters. All of Knuckles' levels are basically hip-hop songs. Sonic's are more rock. Shadow's are more sort of a darker, edgier rock. Rouge's seem to be filled with a lot of like synth keyboard, which I think is supposed to imply she's sort of a more mature, classy character than the rest, which are more high energy, and Robotnik's tend to feel a little bit more industrial. It's very, very cool to see that every character's stages, music feel like they're tuned specifically to the person who's playing them. I like that a lot. And every character has a theme song that is more or less an update to the one they had in the previous game, and in my opinion, mostly an upgrade. Except for Knuckles. Make fun of the goofy rap he had in the previous game, at least I could understand the lyrics to that. This one, it's so overproduced, I have no idea what any of the lyrics are. On the flippity flop though, every single level of his has lyrics to it, and it's very goofy, cheesy, family-friendly hip-hop. You know, kind of like Will Smith's early career. And seriously, if you've not done the electric slide to the opening synth jam of Meteor Herd, you have not lived a fulfilling life, friend. Also, this is a game that unironically uses the lyrics, "I am the Eggman, that's what I am, and it somehow rocks." The soundtrack to this game is amazing. Basically, the presentation of this game is absolutely awesome. Now, if you want a copy of Sonic Adventure 2 on Steam, it is available for $14, and that is an absolute steal, both for the sheer volume of content this game gives you that's really, really fun to play, but also the fact that you don't have to also buy a memory card and a GameCube controller and a GameCube and a GameCube AV cable and a GameCube power source all piecemeal, because that adds up. This is a far more affordable option than what I had to do way back when I was like 10 years old. And someone sent me this copy, and in a weird sense of the world being a very, very small place despite how big it is, I was actually talking to them about my history with Sonic Adventure, and it turns out they were one of the people I helped on GameFAQs all those years ago. How cool is that? So I guess all of my actions way back then had an impact even today. That makes me feel pretty good about myself, and I don't get that too often, so that was cool. And once again, thank you for sending me this. This has been an absolute blast to go through and play this game all over again. Sonic Adventure 2 is a very meaningful game to me. It was the first GameCube game I ever had. It was the first game I ever bought with my own money. And it has been with me for a very, very long time. I've spent so much time with this game, and it has been deeply ingrained with me and my life in a lot of different ways. And I just love this game. I think it is probably my favorite game in the series, despite the issues I've noticed more and more as time went on. I think this game is at its core very, very good and very, very special, and I think that's why it hurts so much to see what Sonic has become since then. This is what I consider to probably be the best game in the series, but after this, it was just weird experimental stuff that Sega couldn't ever commit to, rushed out stuff that never felt all that good. And don't get me wrong, this game is buggy too, but you know, much less so than 06, let's be honest. But since this game came out, I've been desperately waiting for a Sonic Adventure 3, and I think that's why something like Spark the Electric Jester 2 matters so much to me. That was a game that was clearly made by someone who played Sonic Adventure 2 and loved it as much as I did and wanted to do something similar. And that's the only game I've really ever played that managed to capture the feel that Sonic Adventure 2 had. Sonic Adventure 2 is, I think, a very special game, and I think it's a real shame that Sega never revisited it. That they never went out of their way to try and make a Sonic Adventure 3. That they never went back to Extreme Fishing featuring Duke Nukem. That they ignored the KO Garden forever afterwards. This was a special game that did a lot of things, and maybe it didn't do everything perfectly. Maybe some of its decisions were absolutely bizarre and confusing at the best of times. But Sonic Adventure 2 is a very special game. It's very personally important to me, and I gotta recommend this game. If only for how much it means to me.
Sayonara, Shadow the Hedgehog.